Hey guys, welcome back to our third chapter, the chapter that's on Reconstruction. So we just ended with the Civil War, and really the lasting notion of that chapter is not winning the war and Lee's surrender to Grant, but it's instead Lincoln's assassination. And really those last few events that we talked about in our last Ed puzzle, the election of 1864, Lincoln's second inaugural address, and his assassination really paved the way for what is the future of the next period in American history. And when in AP we take a look at different blocks of time, and this period that we talk about Reconstruction is 1865 to 1877. It's a defined time period in American history that is from the end of the Civil War until what's called the Compromise of 1877, which we'll end our chapter with. But this period is all about the federal government's attempt to bring back the South after having won the war, welcoming the states back to the Union. How that will be done is really the discussion that we'll have. But it's largely considered to be unsuccessful and is going to have major ramifications down the road, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. When we get to the civil rights movement, Jim Crow era, things like that. It's an incredibly controversial time period. It's, like I said, largely unsuccessful, but it was incredibly necessary. There's no question about that. If we look at what the South was left really after the war, after Sherman's path of destruction to Savannah, nearly 2/3 of the South's shipping industry had been destroyed thanks to the Union blockade. 9,000 of its railroads, if you remember that image from our article on Sherman's Trail of Tears, as the article calls it, they were literally tying railroad tracks together so they couldn't be used. As a result, the value of Southern property drops tremendously, over 70%, because so much of it had been destroyed, which is also going to have negative ramifications when we talk about Northerners trying to buy up property. And then lastly, the South lost nearly 1/5 of its male population during the war. So it's got to recover in so many different ways, and Reconstruction is the plan to do that. The question is how. Abraham Lincoln, if you remember from reading his second inaugural address, his whole approach to his second term will be bringing the Union back, binding the moods. He says, with charity for all, malice towards none. Right? The idea that we need to welcome back the South as brothers, much like Lee did with Grant at Appomattox. So we call his approach the prodigal son view. Right? If you think of the biblical story, right, welcoming the son that has been lost, not holding any of his previous sins against him. Instead, we're just going to look to the future. The counter to that is within Lincoln's own party, the radical Republicans. And their idea is state suicide, as it's called. We need to punish the South. That's their mantra, punish the South. We need to strike them down to the very beginning, rebuild their society so that this can never happen again. If Lincoln's plan had been followed through upon, it probably would have been largely successful with his approach. The radical Republican plan, which is going to be enforced, just isn't. But Lincoln had been thinking about the post-war era ever since really 1863. After Antietam and after the Battle of Gettysburg, he knows that this war is basically over. It's just a matter of when. So he begins planning his approach to what will post-war America look like. How will we bring the South back? And it's called the 10% plan. You were asked to read this for homework last night. I'd like you to take a second right now and just reread that. So as it says, there's a lot that's in there, but Lincoln offers a pardon to any former Confederates that are willing to take an oath of allegiance. And you just read what that was. And basically saying that you'll never do harm to the United States again, basically. That wasn't extended to all. High Confederate officials, a guy like Jefferson Davis, for example, would not have been included under that. Or any Confederate officers who had killed African-American prisoners of war. So people can take that oath of allegiance. Once you get to 10%, a state can begin writing its constitution and apply for re-entry to the United States. An interesting part of Lincoln's plan that maybe goes back to our DBQ question about the Great Emancipator. He did not require in his plan political rights and voting rights to be given to African Americans. That's a really important point. Remember, he talks about in the Lincoln-Douglas debates that he's not willing to give political rights to African Americans. And he did not include that here. Whether that was a personal choice or a political choice can certainly be debated. But it did require that you had to recognize the 13th Amendment, which freed slaves and would provide opportunities for Black education in the South, which would be important for job training for those that had never had it before. Lincoln, ironically, faces most of the opposition not from the South, but instead from his own party, the section of his party called the Radical Republicans, which are increasingly becoming the majority after 1864. You have guys like Charles Sumner, Ben Wade, Senator Davis, Thaddeus Stevens, some big-time radical Republicans. They think Lincoln's plan is far too lenient. He hasn't done nearly enough to punish the South. I'm just going to keep repeating that phrase over and over again because that's what they want to do. And they propose their own plan called the Wade-Davis Bill, which you're going to read right now. So it's a much stricter plan, right? Requires over 50% of voters in the South to swear a loyalty oath. Lincoln was afraid of how much damage it would do to the South and how much resentment it might cause, as opposed to his plan, which is much more of a welcoming plan. Theirs is really an exclusionary plan. So he pocket vetoes that plan in 1864. If you remember, tying back into those three events I talked about, the election of 1864, right? You see the political cartoon here, Lincoln versus McClellan. Lincoln, in order to win, nominates for his vice president Andrew Johnson, right? A former Democrat, a Southerner from Tennessee, and a former slave owner. Again, in his Machiavellian ways of appealing, getting things done without caring about the means. His goal here is to show some bipartisanship to former Democrats, but also welcome back the South. After Lincoln's assassination, Reconstruction will fall to him. He creates his own plan, called the Johnson Plan for Reconstruction, the presidential plan for Reconstruction, that basically has no requirements and basically gives all Southerners a pass and allows them to rewrite their Constitution without a 10% requirement. And you're going to read that right now. So for obvious reasons, you could probably say that it's very biased towards the South, that plan, right? And it didn't stand a chance in Congress. Congress vetoes his plan, doesn't even let it get to the floor because they see it as a potential return for what are called redeemer governments is the term that we're going to use. So you've really got three different avenues for Reconstruction here. You have Lincoln's plan, the prodigal son view, you have radical Republicans and their state suicide, and then you have President Johnson, which is basically anything goes, just come on back in. But we do get a plan, as we're going to see. We do get laws passed. We're going to get the Military Reconstruction Act. We're going to get the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. And African Americans around the country, South and the North, are just rejoicing over their newfound freedom, right? You see this quote here, everybody went wild, we all felt like horses. We was free, just like that, we was free. Now, freedom is awesome, but that requires economic independence, political independence, the ability to grow. You need land and property. So this was actually a plan put in by our friend from the last chapter, General William Tecumseh Sherman. He confiscated lands in the South and gave 40-acre plots to African-American families, basically as repayment, if you will, for their time in servitude. It was actually taken away from them later on. But in response, Congress creates the Freedmen's Bureau, which was an organization basically to help African Americans transition out of slavery. It gave them clothing, medical supplies, job training, meals. It was instituted by 1865 and basically gone by 1869. As we're going to see, basically white people get sick of Reconstruction and just don't care anymore. And it really falls by the wayside. So with congressional Reconstruction put in place, Southern states begin rejoining the Union slowly. But as we're going to see, nothing really changes. Once that 50% threshold is met, then all of a sudden you have new governments being created in the South. And guess who is hopping right back into state governments? Former Confederate generals, former Confederate officers. And what we're going to get is basically reinforced slavery in the South. It's called sharecropping, which is basically equivalent to slavery. We get black codes, which you're going to read momentarily. And these were laws that basically established virtual slavery, curfews, awful work contracts, the sharecropping that I talked about. We're also going to get the rise of the KKK. Now, it is not nearly as powerful an organization as it will become in the 20s, but you have this group of white Southerners, small group at the time because they don't really last very long, but that are intimidating African Americans when they go to vote, that are lynching them, as we'll see. And so as these states start passing these new laws when they re-enter the Union, Congress gets pissed. So they pass what's called the Civil Rights Act of 1867 in order to outlaw black codes. But it's vetoed by Johnson. So this is where we're getting already an adversarial relationship. Remember, Johnson's a Southerner, former slave owner. Congress, very radical Republican. They want to punish the South. So what we're getting is already this relationship between the two that we're going to see is only going to further escalate. It's eventually overridden by Congress. So it does pass, but Congress then passes the 14th Amendment, fearful that the Supreme Court might overrule them, passes the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So for the first time, we are guaranteeing African-American independence as citizens, excuse me. So we're going to stop here, but what we're building is the adversarial relationship between Johnson and Congress. It will eventually lead to his impeachment. But what we're starting to see is while there's a plan for Reconstruction and there's this hope of what to do, in reality, it doesn't work. And while the federal government might have a plan, the states are going to have their own plan as well.